Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Jazakallah khair everyone for attending this lecture. This will be the fourth and final lecture on this mini Andalus series. So today's lecture will be mostly focused on the fall of the Almohads, the Emirate of Granada, and also the Muslim experience following the fall of Granada. So we were meant to do 5 weeks. First is actually 4. Then we decided to do 5, but because I've got a few assignments next week, we decided to cut in half and do 4 and 5 together. So inshallah it'll be of benefit. So to recap where we are right now in the series is that last week we started in the year 1000, or more specifically 1002 CE, where Al-Mansur died, and he was replaced by his son as the Hajib, or the Chamberlain, called Abdul Malik. And then afterwards he died only after 6 years, and he was replaced by Sanjul, also known as Little Sancho. And due to the fact that he wasn't very cunning, he wasn't very clever, he infringed upon the actual caliph. Even though he was a figurehead, Hisham II, there was this kind of understanding that Hisham II was the caliph, but the Hajib, the Chamberlain, would call the shots. However, because he wanted to become the caliph himself, he told Hisham, all right, make me caliph. And so he agreed to it. But this caused the end of the caliphate of Cordoba, because there was civil war. One caliph would get replaced by another one, and so on and so forth. And so as a result, there was a whole civil war. This led to 30 independent Taifa states, and this comes from the Arabic word Maluk al-Tawaif, meaning party kings, and they ruled the Iberian Peninsula. Think about it, 30 little emirs, 30 little kings ruling such a small piece of land. Think about it, Portugal and Spain are not that big. They're not like India, they're not like Pakistan, they're not like China. Spain is very, very small. So 30 little states. And even though there was political instability, even though, they would fight one another, and they would get the help from the northern Christians, and they would pay tributary taxes while they would ask for the soldiers, and they would fight one another. There was infighting between the Muslims because due to the political instability of the situation. However, even though there was this kind of chaos, culturally Islamic Spain would reach new heights, despite the fact, because the reason for this was that these kings, they would patronize poets, philosophers, scientists, all of these kind of niches and fields. But due to this political instability, the Muslims started to lose the territory within Spain. Cities like Madrid, around Madrid was actually under the Muslims for about 300 years. The northern Christians, they took it. Then they took Zamora. No one really batted an eyelid. They were like, oh, it's fine. However, the city that fell, that caused everyone to panic, that caused the Muslims to panic, was Toledo. Why was Toledo important? Because it was a cultural and economic center. We had Cordoba, we had Sevilla. Toledo was the 3rd city. The 4th city was Valencia, and we'll talk about it in due course. But Toledo was very important. So this shocked the Muslims. So they called on these Amazigh from North Africa by the name of the Almorabitun, or the Almoravids, led by a very pious man by the name of Yusuf ibn Tashfun. May Allah have mercy on him. He, stabilized the situation in Al-Andalus, right? He stabilized the situation. But the Almoravid rule in Spain was very short. It was only about 60 years at max, from 1086 up until 1147. Very short. As a result, after the Almoravids rule, a new Amazigh dynasty came to the fore, and that was the Almohads. And we talked about how the Almohads had a kind of different perception of Islam. They mixed in different ideologies: Shiaism, Sunniism, Khawarijism, Sufism, all of these kind of ideas, and they mixed it up, and they had their own Mahdi and stuff like that. However, they still had some sort of support within Al-Andalus. Why? Because they stabilized the situation again. The Almohads, also known as the Almowahidun, they rose up and they ruled for a bit. And it took them up until 1172 to consolidate power in Al-Andalus. They reached their greatest extent in Spain in 1172. However, as they rose, they started to decline as well. So the reign of Abu Yusuf, who we start to see the problems unraveling for the Almohads in Andalus. One thing that the Andalusis didn't like about the Almohads was that they were Amazigh. And this is the harsh reality of the situation. They didn't like them because they were Amazigh and they were Andalusi. They were mixed of all these different kind of cultures, and over 300, 400 years, they came to be identified themselves as Andalusi. They were both Muslim, but the Andalusis didn't like Almohad rule. Furthermore, due to the fact that their interpretation of Islam was quite different to what the Andalusis practiced, because the Andalusis were quite lax in their deen. They followed the Maliki madhab. They were more of the Sunni kind of manhaj. With the Almohads, it was a bit different. Yes, they proclaimed themselves to be of Sunni inclinations, but they had different understandings, and the Andalusis didn't like this. And at the same time, in the 1170s and the 1180s, just as they reached their greatest extent, the Almohads started to lose bit by bit. They started to lose piece by piece parts of Andalus. They call them the frontier zones. So they started to lose them. So this, this caused concern for Abu Yusuf. So remember we talked about there was the Mahdi ibn Tumart, then we had Abdul Mu'min, then we had Abu Yaqub Yusuf, and then Abu Yusuf Yaqub. So these are the four rulers. And so Abu Yusuf Yaqub is probably the last of the good rulers of the Almohads. And he set out for a campaign in 1195. Why? Because he was concerned at the fact that there was slowly, the Christians in the north and even the central regions of the Iberian Peninsula, they were slowly taking land. So this caused Abu Yusuf to set out on a campaign, and he defeated the Christian kingdoms. Though what happened? He died 4 years later. So the Christians, they wanted to exact revenge. And this came about 13 years later after his death in 1212 at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. And the Christians, they had a well-designed assault. They defeated and they ousted. It was a complete routing for the Muslims. It was a complete routing for the Almohads. And this is what we believe is the decline of the Almohad. Like, this is the actual start of the decline of the Almohads. And they also start to lose power because there's new Taifa states appearing within Al-Andalus, within these cities. This is due to governors, officials, commanders, local strongmen, members of the religious class. They start to achieve independence. So remember, we had the first Taifa period at the start of the mid of the 10th century. Then we had another Taifa period during the end of the Almoravid rule, and then again we have a third Taifa period during the end of the Almohad period. And the Almohads, they're completely ousted by the 1230s, 1240s, right? But in North Africa, they rule and they drag on up until 1269 when the Marinids defeat them. And the Marinids are North African dynasty that ruled parts of modern-day Morocco. But let's go back to Al-Andalus. So in the 1230s and the 1240s, three of the great cities fall. Three of the great cities that we associate with Al-Andalus, they fall to the Christians. This is Cordoba, Valencia, and Sevilla. They fall to the Christians at such a rapid rate that it shocks the Muslims. And I know we haven't talked about Valencia a lot in this series, but Valencia was important. It was, it had very good agricultural output. It had a lot of, it had good silk production. And, as everywhere in all the cities of Al-Andalus, there was irrigation, fertile lands. Every single city in Al-Andalus prospered to a certain degree. And this is, again, what we talked about last week, about the rizq that Allah granted to the Andalusians, that, they experienced unmatched prosperity, from the 820s, about 100 years after the conquest, up until 1492. And we'll see in due course how all the time, even when there's political instability, even when, there's fighting amongst Muslims, there was all this opulence, there was all this wealth, there's all this prosperity. SubhanAllah, it shows you how, even though there was all this issues, there was still, they enjoyed richness. And we'll see how it was their downfall, inshallah. So, let me go to Cordoba. That's the first city that falls. And remember, Cordoba was called by European writers the ornament of the world. There was paved and well-lit streets. There were 70 libraries in Cordoba alone. There wasn't even 70 libraries in the whole of, Western Europe combined. France, Germany, UK. I'm just saying these countries now, the modern day borders, but they weren't called that back in the day. Italy, France, all of these places, they didn't have 70 libraries. In one city in Cordoba, they had 70 libraries. Of course, Cordoba kind of lost its prestige, in the sense that it wasn't the most advanced city in the world anymore, but it still had that kind of fame. Cordoba is a Muslim city. Like back in the day, in the 900s, when it was the ornament of the world, they said, some of the writers, they said that if Islam had a fourth holiest site, it would be Cordoba, because of the luminaries that would frequent, the Muslims that would frequent the mosques, the city, the luminaries that the city produced. But of course, this is a kind of a rhetoric that these writers would say. So, regarding Cordoba, after the Almohad rule ended, a man by the name of Ibn Hud Mutawakkil became the governor. He became the ruler of Cordoba. And what's interesting is that he was actually called the Emir of Al-Andalus. So he was given this title by who? The Abbasids. And the Abbasids gave him this title, this very big title, right? Someone hasn't been called the Emir of Al-Andalus since Abu Yusuf, Al-Nasir. So he had this grandiose title and he was given it in 1232. Yet 4 years later, Cordoba fell. So what happened is that the king of Castile, so Castile is one of the kingdoms in the north, and also now encroaching in the central regions, they besieged Cordoba, the city of Cordoba. And the way they besieged it wasn't some type of, where they committed thousands of men and they were pummeling the walls of the city. It was actually much worse than that. They sealed off the city so everyone would starve. They sealed off the city, and for 5 months straight, there was deprivation, there was famine, there was, all this suffering. And so, of course, the Muslims, they finally surrendered after 5 months. Imagine a brutal siege. Not much bloodshed in the sense of, there was actual battles. It was a brutal siege of encirclement, right? And so when the Castilians they took the city, they expelled all the Muslims. Every single Muslim in Cordoba was expelled. Think about it. Just before that, it was a Muslim city. Every single Muslim now, after it was surrendered, they had to go straight away. They didn't have a day, they didn't have 5 days, they didn't have 10 days, they didn't have 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you name it. They had to leave straight away. And yes, as I said before, it wasn't the city that was, it wasn't the greatest city in Andalus anymore. That was Sevilla. During the Almohad period, Sevilla became the city of Al-Andalus. But still, it was a shock to the Muslims. But the tragedy doesn't stop there. The next city to fall was Valencia, 2 years later. So, again, this is the Aragonese. The Aragonese are another kingdom in the north. The Aragonese, they seal off the city again. And this causes deprivation, starvation, famine, and there was a blockade by land and sea. And so the Muslims of Valencia, they resisted for at least a year. And they had to surrender again. Why? Because, they couldn't eat, they couldn't drink. So it was a lose-lose situation. Again, and this wasn't, again, like a battle. This was just, a blockade. And you see this happened in Toledo, this happened in Cordoba, this happened in Valencia, and as we'll see in due course, this also happened in Sevilla. This is how they took the cities. They didn't take the cities through well-designed assaults. They didn't take it through, crushing through, a military victory, but rather through, blockades. There was mass starvation, there was mass deprivation due to this blockade. And the Muslims only had 5 days to leave Valencia. So, of course, because we'll talk about Valencia later on, there was the city of Valencia and there was the region of Valencia. You know how we have New York and New York City? They had 5 days to depart the city, only 5 days. So they were a bit more merciful this time, 5 days to leave and gather whatever property you could hold, but still is a brutal situation. Then the last notable city to fall was Sevilla. Sevilla was the economic, religious, cultural center of Al-Andalus at that time. It was the city. When Almohad rule waned away and it faded, there was other rulers that came to the fore within Sevilla. So we had Ibn Hud, who ruled Cordoba as well. But we also have the Hafsids that ruled. The Hafsids ruled Sevilla, and the Hafsids were a North African dynasty that ruled cities like Bejaia, Tunis, Tripoli. So they also had some sort of control. Remember, there's a theme. You had the Almoravids, you had the Almohads, and you also had the Hafsids. So North Africa is very intertwined with Al-Andalus, the Amazigh more specifically. So Sevilla was a complete mess. And furthermore, when the Almohad rule faded away, Christians and Muslims, they would raid the city for petty stuff. They would just raid the city. Oh, let me take this money, or let me take this loot, or let me take that, let me take this. So it showed you that people didn't really care about, let's live in this city and keep it peaceful. They just wanted to make money. They just wanted, petty reasons to, do nonsense, for lack of a better word. So again, Fernando, they call him Fernando the Wise, Fernando the 10th. And we'll get on to why they call him in Western academia, why they give him such name. He sieged, again, he sieged Sevilla alongside a Muslim ruler by the name of Ibn al-Ahmar. And you know what they done again? They blockaded it by sea and land. So there was total suffering and famine again. You see, there's a constant theme of the way they took these cities was through deprivation. And one thing is that the Hafsids, they tried to help. They tried to help the Sevillans. They sent a ship through the Guadalquivir River. And the Guadalquivir River comes from the Arabic word Al-Kabir, Al-Wadi Al-Kabir, meaning the Great River. And the Muslims named it when they landed in Spain in 711 CE. So the Hafsids, they sent a ship, but it was turned around by the Castilian admiral. It was turned around, so they couldn't help them. And so they encircled the city, and it was so much suffering for the Muslims that, when you do a janazah prayer, from the day the person dies up until the janazah, I know it's quick, but there's certain rites you have to do, clean them and stuff like that, yeah? They couldn't even do that for the nobility, for the higher ups within Sevilla. Why? Because of the complete suffering that was happening. No food, no water, nothing. There was nothing there. So they couldn't do janazah prayer. It was that bad. So of course, the Muslims, they eventually surrendered. And they had 1 month to take their property and leave. And you may be thinking, 1 month is better now. But I'll tell you why this is not the case. Because, for example, if I know you have 1 month to leave the UK and you have to sell all your stuff, I'm going to haggle because I know you're in a more needy position, right? So, and we'll talk about it later on, how when the Jews were expelled from Spain, they had 4 months to take everything and leave. They had 4 months to take and sell the stuff and take what they could and leave. However, because people knew they had to leave, they would haggle and then undercut them on the last day because you'd get desperate, right? So this is the thing. People say, 1 month, that's okay, but still, the non-Muslim citizens of Sevilla knew that they were in a needy position. They had to sell their stuff. They only had a month. Let's wait until the last day, until they have no time left, and haggle them for a price. So it's not as rosy as it may seem. They were given safe passage every time they left. And one thing about Castilians, the Aragonese, they took these different cities. Of course, the major cities like Cordoba, Sevilla, Valencia, the Muslims were expelled. But other cities, the Muslims were allowed to stay. And as we talked about last week, the dhimma status was reversed. And these Muslims in Christian lands were called mudajis. And it comes from the Arabic word al-majun, which means those who remained. The ulama would try and force and encourage the Muslims to leave and go to the only state that was Muslim at that time, and that was the Emirate of Granada. However, many stayed, and those are the Mudajis. And the Mudajis, as I said before, you know how when there's Islamic rule, there's the Dhimma status where you pay jizya and you have your own churches, synagogues, you have your own laws, your own schools, all of these kind of things. The same thing happened for the Muslims under Christian rule in the state of Aragon and in the state of Castile. So, for example, they would pay a certain tax and they would have self-autonomy. They would be in their own communities and stuff like that. They were still prosperous. So they excelled in industries such as medicine, horse care, luxury tailoring, silversmithing, decorative arts, and weapons making. And furthermore, the Muslims, they were asked to build what? Can anyone guess what they were asked to build?
Churches?
Churches, yes. Jazakallah khair. And this is, subhanAllah, when I went to Spain at the start of July, I got lost, right? I went to the masjid with all the people, and then we went to the Roman bridge, which is next to the masjid. And when we were walking back, I went to the masjid because there's fountains there, right? And they went to another place. So I got lost. And so I was walking around the city of Cordoba. And then I passed through this church. And this church looked like a masjid. I thought maybe it was a mosque that got converted into a church. But in reality, when I looked on Google, and even there's a sign there, if I remember correctly, that this was built by the Mudajis. So they actually were financed to build their own churches. And subhanAllah, it looks like a mosque. You think it just got converted like last week. SubhanAllah. So definitely, something to ponder on how, the architecture of Spain is influenced by Islam and Islamic architecture. So going back to the topic of the Mudajis, the Muslims that lived under Christian rule, they again experienced unmatched prosperity. They experienced so much rizq in terms of because the trades they had, they were merchants, they were businessmen, they were medics, they were doctors, all of this kind of stuff. So again, they experienced unmatched prosperity in such a climate. And one interesting thing about the Arabic the Muslim influence from the Mudajis in Spain is they developed not a language, but a script, and it's called Al-Jamado. So, we read Spanish today, English, French, Italian, all of these in the Latin alphabet, right? P, A, B, L, O, that kind of stuff. The Muslims, or the Mudajis, developed their own script, the Arabic script, but for the Castilian language, and it's called Al-Jamado. And the reason for this was that they wanted to preserve their identity, they wanted to preserve their religion. You know how, for example, Urdu is not is not part of the Arabic language, but it uses the Arabic script. For example, Persian, the same thing. What other countries use it? Back in the day, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, they used to do it the same way. Even Indonesia, Malaysia, all these countries, at one point in time, they had an Arabic script. The Ottoman Empire as well, Turkish. So they developed this script, and it developed in the 13th century because they wanted to, teach their kids how to read the Quran. Because if they were learning, how the Latin alphabet, it would be much harder to learn the Quran when they're learning, when they're reading Arabic. So this is one thing that the Mudajis left an imprint on the Spanish society. And another thing is some words in the Arabic language actually come from Arabic. So we all know what inshallah means. In Spanish, the word ojalá means hopefully, and inshallah, God willing, and it also means hopefully. Ojalá.
Like inshallah.
Yeah, literally comes from that word. Another word is, when people say ole, ole, that kind of stuff, it actually comes from the word Allah. And you know how, of course, it's wrong. We invoke Allah sometimes when we just say His name like that. That's what the Muslims would do in Spain, and the Christians took it, and over time it changed to ole. So this is one interesting thing that the Muslim influence in Spain. However, it was not all sunshine and rainbows. Sorry, it wasn't all hunky dory for the Muslims under Christian rule. The Mudajirs, they started to suffer due to the fact there was famines, plagues, and there was warfare, which caused the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile to be on the brink of economic collapse. So as a result, the Muslims, the Mudajirs, they started to get persecuted in these lands, and so Muslims started to again leave these lands. They went to the only place that they could go to, and that was Granada. But one interesting thing, because I know it's not really chronological, but I want to give them more interesting points about Al-Andalus and the Muslims and their impact in Spain, and that is, did you know the Renaissance? Anyone can tell me someone famous from the Renaissance? Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, you said? Anyone else? Raphael. Donatello. You know Donatello actually on him, or is it Dante? You know he got a lot of influences from the Muslims. Machiavelli. Fibonacci. So if it wasn't for the Muslims in Spain, there would be no Michelangelo, there would be no Da Vinci, there would be no Raphael, there would be none of these people. Why? Because remember when Toledo fell? Toledo fell in 1085, and when Alfonso, when he entered Toledo, he saw all this knowledge, all these books, all these intellectual, like Muslims and Jews and Christians. Because it was a intellectual center during the times of Al-Andalus. So there was all these books and all this knowledge, and so what the Christians done is that they started a translation movement. So it wasn't a very organized movement. There would be bishops, priests, there would be rulers that they would come to Toledo and start translating books. And this got picked up during the time of Alfonso the Wise. That's why he's called Alfonso the Wise, because he started this, or he patronized a lot of works on translations, right? From theology to law to politics to music. I know that's haram, but all of these kind of things that chess, hunting, astronomy, all of these kind of things, the Alfonso, he paid scholars, or he paid Muslims to translate from Arabic or check the translation, and he paid Christians to do the translation into the Romance languages. And the Romance languages is not Romance in the sense of Bollywood. Romance is in the sense that the Romans, they spoke Latin, right? They spoke and read Latin. And Latin evolved into languages such as Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, Romanian, these kind of languages. And that's why they call it the Romance languages. And so, it'd probably be in Castilian, Italian, and the Arabs and the Jews, or the Muslims and the Jews, they would check the Arabic translation, because the Jews mastered the Arabic language, of course the Muslims, because that was the lingua franca of Spain. And the reason why he done this was due to the fact that he was influenced by, guess what dynasty? Guess what dynasty he was influenced by? The Almohads. The Almohads that seem a bit crazy, and they had some outlandish ideas. But the Almohads, they patronized a lot of works. They were a big advocate for literary excellence. For example, remember we talked about last week that Abu Yaqub, he had a library that rivaled Al-Hakam's, and Al-Hakam's had between 400 to 600,000 books. And so the city of Toledo became this center of the translation movement. But there was all these different centers in other parts of Spain. And as a result, because lots of Europeans, they went to Toledo to pick up these works, these translated works, they brought it back to their respective regions. For example, France, England, Germany, but most importantly, Italy. And that's where we see the height of the Renaissance. So all this knowledge that they got from Toledo, they actually had it before, about 1,400 years ago or 1,300 years ago, during the Roman times, during the Byzantine times, during the Persian times, the Egyptian times. So how this happened, the sequences that led to this is that, you know, we had these great empires, for example, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the ancient Egyptians, even in India, the Persians, you know, the Sasanians. They all focused on intellectual output, on, you know, trying innovations and advancements and all of that kind of stuff. But then what happened is that when the Rashidun, the Abbasids, they, you know, gained, you know, they were in contact with all these different regions, you know, North Africa, the Middle East, you know, Sindh, which is modern day Pakistan, Central Asia, and Anatolia. They got into contact with all these works. So all these works that were known to the Europeans and the Persians and all these people. What happened next is that the Arabs, they started this translation movement. And so that's why we get the Islamic Golden Age, which starts in Baghdad and it spreads all across the world. And these translated works, what did the Muslims do? They don't just translate it. They see the knowledge, they take it, and they improve on it. And then this, the knowledge, it gets imported to other parts of the Muslim world. Because back in those days, even though there was fighting between different states, it was kind of like one Muslim state to a certain degree, where people could travel with no issue. As I was saying, the knowledge arrived to Spain. And so the Muslims had this knowledge in Spain, and then it got imported back to Europe. So the Romans, you know, the Romans that ruled the Italian peninsula and other parts of Europe, they had this knowledge. Now again, the Italians, 1,000 years later, they got access to this knowledge again. And, you know, they once thought this knowledge was lost, but they regained it. And one thing, and this is the reason why the Renaissance happened, it was not what these Ottoman fanboys say. And don't get me wrong, I don't hate the Ottomans, I like the Ottomans. But there's two, you know, diverging opinions. Some people think they're the best thing since sliced bread. Some people think they're, you know, they give crazy accusations. The Ottomans were somewhere in the middle. No, Ottoman fanboys, they say that the Renaissance happened because what city fell to them? No. What city did the Ottomans take? Constantinople. In what year? 1453. Yeah. Can you tell the time as well?
You don't say it.
In the morning.
You're actually right.
I'm not joking. After Salafshin.
So the Muslims, they took Constantinople. And what happened is that this was a Greek city under the Byzantines, or they're actually called the Romans, the Byzantines. But when 100 years after the Ottomans, they took Constantinople, the Western academics, they started saying, no, this is called the Byzantines, not the Romans. But they themselves used to call themselves the Romans. That's why the Quran states, you know, Soma Rum, because they would call themselves the Romans. But the reason why they changed it was because the Muslims conquered Constantinople. So they wanted to disassociate from the, from that. Yeah, exactly. It was not even 200 years later. I think it was German. He was a German historian.
So they conquered Constantinople.
And what happened is that there was Greeks.
Yes.
There was Greeks, and these Greeks brought the knowledge to Europe. Yeah. But this is, you know, this is a very weak opinion. Most historians state that the origins of the Renaissance came from Al-Andalus. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to get that out there. You get me, inshallah. So regarding Granada. So now the Emirate of Granada, it is, so the Emirate of Granada starts in 1232 or 1238. There's two different opinions regarding that, because 1232 he actually calls himself the Sultan, but in 1238 is that where he actually, you know, establishes a functional state. And Ibn al-Ahmar, even though he's, we can't use colorful words on him, but, you know, he did help the Christians in the siege of Sevilla, and he did, you know, do certain things that, you know, put the Muslims in a bad situation. This is, you know, this is history. We have to say, you know, we have to call it a spade, right? He was a strong ruler. He was a strong ruler because he laid the foundations for 250 years of Muslim rule, or the last 250 years of Muslim rule in Spain. The Emirate of Granada. Again, the Emirate of Granada, experienced prosperity. And you can see it's a theme throughout the history of Spain, throughout the history of Muslim Spain, that prosperity was a fundamental aspect of their existence. You know, the Emirate of Cordoba, the Caliphate of Cordoba, the Taifa period, the Almoravid, the Almohad, the Emirate of Granada, every single era, every single time, every single place, you know, there was prosperity within Al-Andalus. It shows you how much, you know, they got bestowed these blessings and they squandered it, subhanAllah. So the reason why the economy was so strong in Al-Andalus, in Granada, was due to farmers and craftsmen that flocked to the state. So, you know, when all the cities started to fall, Cordoba, Valencia, Sevilla, because they were skilled refugees, they went to Granada. And this, you know the opposite of a brain drain. It caused, you know, an influx of skilled laborers. And, you know, because they had those connections with Aragon and Castile, and because Aragon and Castile had connections with outside of Spain, you know, Italy, France, and all of these kind of places, they had a consumer base, they had connections. So their produce and their products and their skills could be made to good use. And agricultural production was robust as a consequence of centuries of Andalusi experimentation and innovation in irrigation, fertilization, and farming techniques. Because over the centuries, they perfected, you know, the farming techniques, the irrigation, the fertilization. So the land, the land was good to, you know, do produce. Another thing is that there was a lot of silk production, there was a lot of weaving, there was Nasrid textiles, which were high quality, bright colors, rich brocade. They were exported across Europe, and the Europeans loved this. And as a result of this, you know, the produce that they made, the Europeans, they didn't want to see Granada fall. Why? Because they would receive all these textiles, all these, you know, valuable products, and so they didn't want to see Granada fell, because if Granada fell, all these, you know, skilled laborers, all these people that knew how to make these textiles, where would they go? Maybe North Africa, you know, maybe they would get persecuted in the onslaught of an invasion. So the Europeans actually, they kind of stalled the fall of, not the actual Spanish, but people outside of Spain. They halted the fall of Granada. And one interesting thing was that, you know, there were other industries, for example, leather working, paper making, crystal, ceramics, lusterware. This was all produced. It wasn't, you know, it was so many things produced. And you have to think about, Granada was very small. It was very small, and they were producing so much. And, you know, subhanAllah, they would do this in kind of, not factories that we know nowadays, but the factories for them times, right? It was called factories. And this is the thing why, you know, I think comments should be banned for history videos on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. I'll tell you why, yeah? Because Roy Casagrande was talking about this. And me, as I wouldn't call myself a historian, but someone that's doing a master's in history and trying to become a historian, I knew exactly what he meant when he said there was factories producing all of this production, these textiles and whatnot. But people in the comments would be either being obtuse or they're downright stupid. Because the thing is, yeah, when we use words, it doesn't mean exactly what it meant back then, right? High industrial factories. People are saying, oh, the Industrial Revolution didn't happen 500 years later. I'm thinking, that's the prosperity of Al-Andalus. See, again, Allah, like, how many times I have to reel in this point? Allah granted them so much rizq. And he made them an example of, you know, he made an example of the Andalusians, that they had so much rizq. But because they weren't diligent in their deen, because they were dancing, singing, and doing all of this kind of nonsense, they lost it. SubhanAllah. So let's talk about the society of Granada. So Granada was much different to Al-Andalus before, because Al-Andalus, it was 30% in the 9th century, then it was 80% in, you know, the early 11th century. You know, it was not always homogeneous, Al-Andalus, but the Emirate of Granada was homogeneous. The vast majority, I'd say between 90 to 95%, were Muslim, Arab speaking and Muslim. And there was very few Christians. Also poor Christian farmers in the Sierra Nevada, the Alpujarra mountain ranges. So there was not many Christians. There was not even many Jews. The reason for this was that many of them were in the Christian kingdoms. We'll see how they actually come later on to Al-Andalus, to Granada. Let me talk about that now. So there was a small small Jewish community. They were very small, and it wasn't like, how it was before, where we had luminaries such as, it wasn't like Samuel Hanagid, who was a vizier. It wasn't like Hazrat ibn Shaprut, who was a vizier as well. They never reached the Nasrid administration. They never reached such heights as they had prior. But they were still prosperous, and they were rich and all of that kind of stuff. But we do see an influx of Jewish refugees in the year 1391. And this is from Castile and Aragon. And the reason for this was that a priest in Sevilla, he makes vicious anti-Jewish sermons in the city. He starts to attack the Jewish people, saying anti-Semitic rhetoric. So what happens? A Christian mob, they descend on the Jewish quarter in Sevilla, causing a massacre. And this spreads across Spain, across Christian Spain. So what happens is that a lot of these Jews, they flee to Muslim Spain because they see it as a means of survival. And many of them, they adopted Christianity just to save themselves, just so they wouldn't be killed. But still, it wasn't enough. Because back then, if you were, a converted Christian, from Islam or from Judaism to Christianity, you were still seen as second class. You're still seen as, your blood was impure. They preferred native Christians that had been Christian for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what happened is that these Jewish refugees, they came to Granada, and what were they allowed to do? They were allowed to practice their religion again. They went from Christianity to Judaism. So the greatest influx, let me go back to the topic. The greatest influx of Muslims that arrived to Granada was when the great cities fell. But Muslims continued to arrive. Specifically, in the 14th century, the 1300s, when, as I said before, there was famines, there was diseases, there was all of these kind of issues, and, the pragmatic approach of letting the Muslims live in self-autonomy didn't work anymore. So what happened? That the more Muslims started to come, to arrive to Granada. So as a result, there was an even greater influx, and Granada was very densely populated as a result, because all the Muslims would see it as the refuge, and it was seen as and the emirs themselves, they would see themselves as the protectors of Islam, because they were the last bastion of Al-Andalus. They were the last remnants of Al-Andalus. And regarding the Emirate of Granada, one interesting thing, and what the most standout point, and what stands out about it, is the Alhambra. Because we can talk about, this happened and that happened, but at the end of the day, there's no more Muslim rule there. But the one thing that remains is the Alhambra, and this is a massive palace. This palace is, subhanallah, is beautiful, and it's very, very big. And what's interesting about the Alhambra is that it was built in the 9th and 10th century, a structure was built there in the 9th, 10th century during the Muslim period. Then Samuel Hanagid, which we have mentioned many times, who was a Jewish vizier in Granada, he built his own palace there. So he had a palace there, but then when the Ibn al-Ahmar came to Granada, he built his palace, and he built the foundations. And over time, we had different rulers extending. And the biggest extensions came during two rulers, Yusuf I and Muhammad V. And there's one very interesting structure within Alhambra, and it's the water clock. And think about it. You know, in the 14th century, these people built a water clock where every hour one part of the water would shoot out. I don't know what the word could
The
be.
one with the lions.
Lions, yeah.
Yeah.
And then at 12, I think it all would do it.
All would do it, yeah.
No, subhanAllah, the Muslims had such intelligence. And nowadays, what are we doing? We're doing nothing. We're doing nothing. You know, back in the day, we had people, you know, seeking knowledge. And seeking knowledge, alhamdulillah, we need to seek knowledge in the deen, right? But we need to seek knowledge in the sciences. We need to seek advancement. We can't just go to uni and get the bachelor's and, oh, I'm an engineer. Sorry, I'm not trying to single you out. Oh, I'm a physicist. We have to benefit the ummah. Yeah, it's not haram to, you know, become the top historian. It's not haram to become the top physician. It's not the haram to become the top doctor. We need to become excellent in every single field, because that's what happened back in the day, and that's why we had all these inventions. That's why we had all these great luminaries that, you know, created 200 surgical instruments, as we talked before. That guy who discovered gravity, Al-Biruni, you know, all of these things, because they were focused. They had a goal. They wanted to benefit the ummah. Nowadays, what we're trying to do, go to uni to feed our bellies. But that's my rant over. I just wanted to incite some kind of inspiration and motivation for the people. So you may be wondering, how did Granada stay afloat for so long? Why was it so, it didn't fall after.
Steady.
It was steady. It didn't fall for, you know, after 60 years, after 100 years, after 150 years. It fell after 250 years. There's multiple reasons for this. So firstly, as we mentioned before, the reason why Granada stayed afloat was due to the fact that, due to their output, their industrial output, the Europeans, they didn't want to see it falling, because, you know, they built such amazing textiles and whatnot. That's the first thing. The second thing was their natural borders. So, you know, does anyone know that the Germans tried to invade Britain in World War II? You all know that, yeah? Invade Britain in World War II.
Because of the RAF? English Channel.
The English Channel, thank you.
I was going to say that.
The English Channel, they couldn't invade it. What is that? That's a natural border. That's a natural border, yeah? Between France and Britain. The same thing with Granada. If you go to Granada, you'll see the Sierra Nevada, you'll see all these mountain ranges. You know, it was not easy for a medieval army to start marching and attack Granada because of the natural terrain, the mountains. So that was one reason why they were unable to bypass Granada. Another reason why they were unable to is due to the fact that Granada was heavily fortified. It was heavily fortified with big towers, strong points everywhere. There was agriculture and artisanal hubs. So if they needed anything, they would quickly make it. And this is also another thing. It was geographically compact. At that time, it was very important because they had such a large population in such a small space that they could mobilize quickly. Unlike, you know, Aragon and Castile, it was sparsely populated, and so to get the men to march down to fight Granada was quite long. However, the Grenadians, they could muster up an army quite quickly. You know, oh, this part is getting besieged or that part is getting besieged. They could muster up an army and put out that fire. Furthermore, these towns and cities, they could produce, they could keep provisions for years. So if they needed, to fight in one area, because of the agricultural production of, you know, fruits and foods and all of that kind of stuff, and because of the textile production, and because of the how compact it was geographically, they could have provisions for years. So if someone besieged it, they could hold out with the army, you know, with the numbers, with the provisions, and so it was very hard to break through Granada and break through their defenses. And lastly, one thing about the Emirate of Granada is that they would play the different enemies against each other. So, for example, we had Castile, we had Aragon, and who else did we have?
Maryland.
The Marinids. When the Marinids would show hostility, sometimes the Marinids would show hostility, they were Muslim, they would get the Castilians and Aragonese support to fight the Marinids. When the Castilians were showing hostilities, they would get the Marinids and the Aragonese, and they would play one another against each other. So they were able to play one another due to their political savviness, right? And also due to the prosperity they had, they were able to have such a prolonged reign. But of course, as every empire rises, there weren't even an empire, but every state rises and falls. This is throughout history. So regarding Granada, it finally fell. It finally fell. The reason why I'm going to talk about it falling, and I haven't really talked about Granada that much, yeah, it's prosperous and it has good defenses, natural defenses, and all of that kind of stuff. It's because the history of Granada is basically this Sultan does this, he fights, he maybe loses, he wins, and this is just repeated. Oh, he allies with the Marinids, then he allies with the Castilians, then he fights the Marinids, all of these kind of things. So this kind of history is very prolonged and boring. So I'm gonna go to the end of Granada. So in 1469, one very big thing happens in history. Can anyone tell me what happens in 1469? No, that's 1478. 1478, yeah. Has anyone heard of Ferdinand? Of
The
marriage, Ferdinand and Isabel, they marry in 1469. So Ferdinand and Isabel marry, and this wasn't a love marriage. This wasn't a marriage. Oh, I fell in love with her. Oh, I fell in love with him, and Bollywood, Hollywood kind of marriage. This was a marriage, or TikTok marriage that you see nowadays on TikTok. What's
that marriage?
What's a marriage? This is a marriage for one goal, was to unite and defeat the Muslims, the last stronghold of Muslim Spain. So they unite the kingdoms in 1478. And another thing happens, as I said before, the Inquisition. So they're gearing up. They're gearing up to eradicate the Emirate of Granada. So they marry in 1479. They unite in 1479, their kingdoms. And 1478 is the Inquisition. So there's these steps that they're taking to defeat the Muslims. So Isabella was anti-Islam. She was proper anti-Islam. That was her life mission. That was her life mission, I'll be honest. Ferdinand was less. He was still a bit, and of course, Christian kings in them times wouldn't love Islam. They would convert if they did. But he was more pragmatic in his approach. Now, what happened in 1453 in Europe? Constantinople fell. So this reignited anti-Islamic rhetoric within Europe. And they united. So what happens when they united? They had one common enemy. The Emirate of Granada, they couldn't play one another against each other. They couldn't, pit Aragon against Castile. They couldn't get the Marinids involved and then backstab the Marinids and all of these kind of things, right? The Aragonese, the Castilians, they're both Catholic. But they have political differences. But so why is there this new vigor of anti-Islam within amongst the Castilians and the Aragonese? Because Constantinople fell in 1453, and even one of the popes, he called a crusade, but it failed miserably. It didn't materialize. But there's still that animosity against the Muslims. Oh, they just took Constantinople. Constantinople was, one of the top 5 most important cities in Christianity. So you have Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, which is Antalya, I think it's called nowadays, Jerusalem, I think Nicaea as well. So these 5 cities were the top 5 cities of Christianity. So Constantinople is a major blow to the Christians. So what happens? This reinvigorates anti-Islamic rhetoric. So the Emirate of Granada was only 75% of its original border. So in the 13th, 14th and early 15th century, certain towns and certain cities would get lost. But this was piecemeal, very, very small, here and there. But it was still 75%, and the Muslims lived there, and as we talked about before, it was prosperous and all of that kind of stuff. The war against Granada begins in 1481. It begins in 1481, and the main goal is to complete the Reconquista of Spain. So the Muslims, they raid this town. They raid this town in 1481 called Zahara. What happens? This gives the pretext to the Catholic monarchs to attack. This gives them the opportunity, for example, they're waiting for a reason to attack. And the Muslims, they raid. And this is, Christians and Muslims would raid each other's territory alike. This was normal in the medieval times and the early modern times. You just go on horseback, raid a city, raid a town, get some loot, and call it a day. 10 toes back to the whatever. So this is normal, right? However, this was used as a pretext. So they mobilized around 60,000 cavalry and infantry troops against Granada. And bit by bit, they start taking towns and cities. For example, Malaga. Malaga, Marbella. White people go to Marbella nowadays for a holiday. Marbella was under the Muslims up until the late 1480s. And for example, let me go back to Malaga. Malaga was, the Muslims resisted for such a long time. And due to this, the whole population was enslaved or given to the Christians as gifts. Then Granada finally gets besieged in 1490. And it's devastating. Like Sevilla, like Cordoba, like Valencia, it's absolutely devastating. There's famine, there's starvation, there's deprivation. And so the Muslims, they can't hold out. And 1 year after, they give in. And because there was 3 sultans during the whole Granada War from 1481 to 1491, because there was infighting, then one would get replaced, and then one would work with the Catholic monarchs, with Isabella and Ferdinand. So there was a lot of political instability, right? What's it called? The Sultan, the Sultan that signed the peace treaty, because after a year, they surrendered. And Boabdil, also known as Abu Abdullah, he signed a peace treaty. And this peace treaty had 67 articles. It had 67 articles granting the Muslim freedom of religion. So I won't go through all of 67 articles. I don't even have it on my notes, but I've still got a long way to go. I'm trying to speed it up. And it was like freedom of religion, so they could have the Adhan, they could elect their own representatives to the Council of Granada. The mayors and governors of Granada who were Christian had to have favorable views towards the Muslims. So there was all this kind of treaties and agreements all these agreements that stated that the Muslims should be treated correctly. They should be treated well. So this is called the Treaty of Granada, and it was signed in November of 1491. And the Sultan, Boabdil or Abu Abdullah, had to leave Granada on the 2nd of January 1492. And has anyone heard of the quote where he's walking, Boabdil, and his mother, and he's crying due to the fall of Granada, and his mother says, "Don't cry like a woman that you couldn't defend as a man." However, this is a myth. This is not true. This never happened. No, you never said that. The same way that when Tariq ibn Ziyad, he landed in Jabal al-Tariq and he burnt all the ships, this is also a myth as well.
Really?
Yeah, it's a myth. Another myth.
Why would you call it a myth then?
There's no evidence for it.
I know.
Also, the Taj Mahal, where they say they chop the hands off? That's also a myth as well. So all of these things that we just hear and some brother says it on the street, most of these... Where was I? So he leaves on the 2nd of January, 1492. And but the Muslims, they're given rights for the time being. This was a pragmatic approach. They were lied to. They were only given this because it was, they couldn't expel everyone. They couldn't exile anyone, even though they gave the option. But because they made it so enticing to stay in Granada, not many people exiled. People did exile, but people still stayed in Granada because it was so enticing. This treaty, you know, the Treaty of Granada, freedom of religion. You'd have the Adhan. You'd have mayors that were pro-Islamic. You know, all of these kind of things. So the Muslims are like, oh, we'll stay here. We'll just live here. You know, it'll be the same. It'll be continuity instead of catastrophe and all of that kind of stuff. And for about 7 years, it was all hunky dory. Yeah, right. There was a priest called Talavera, Fernando de Talavera, and he believed in preaching to the Muslims in a kind and tolerant way. Oh, this is the error of your ways. This is how you convert. This is how he wanted to convert people to Christianity. He was, you know, inviting. During those times, mass, you know, when you go to church, it was all in Latin. He said to the Muslims, if you become Christian, you can do it in Arabic. And you can also do the Zambra. And the Zambra is a dance. Of course, Muslims, we don't dance, but it's associated with the Muslims and Islam. So he said to them, you know, you can have all these practices, become Christian. But he had slow results. Then another bishop came by the name of Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros. And he at the start, he done the same thing. You know, he was inviting and this is the error of your ways, all of that kind of stuff. But what happened? He had slow results. There was slow conversion. So Cisneros, he had slow results. So what did he start doing? Burning Arabic books, burning Qur'ans, burning all of this kind of stuff, beating people to become Christian, sending them to prison. So of course, what would happen? The Muslims revolted. They went to the Al-Puhara mountains and they caused a rebellion for about 2 years. And they had no strategy. You know, normally when you do a rebellion or you have a sort of direction on what you're going to do, they had no kind of idea of what to do. They were in the Al-Puhara mountain ranges in the middle of nowhere. So they had no direction, they just wanted to fight to defend themselves. A kind of rejection of the state. Of course, because the Catholic monarchs were so rich, they had all these, because they ruled Spain and they also ruled parts of Italy. They had all this men, you know, all these human resources. They crushed it in 1501. So it started in 1499 and they managed to end it in 1501. Guess what happened after? They gave the Muslims 3 choices. Can anyone give me those 3 choices?
Live, die, or convert.
Death, exile, or conversion. Most people chose conversion. And as a result, the whole population was converted to Christianity. And this was the time of the Inquisition. So what would the Inquisition do? The Inquisition was not just for non-Muslims, but for lax Christians. So the Inquisition would not harm anyone that was a devout Christian. So anyone was subject to the Inquisition. So the Muslims, they had to hide their identity, they had to hide their practices. And, you know, because if they showed that they were Muslim and they just pretended to be Christian, it'd be, you know, they would be tortured, they would suffer, you know, all of these kind of things. So a mufti from Algeria, Oran or Wahran, he made this fatwa called the Oran Fatwa. And his name is Ahmed ibn Abi Juma. And he said, and this is what he said in his fatwa. He said that, you know, you can practice taqiyya. And taqiyya is where you hide your religion. And this is not Shia taqiyya, where you just say, oh, the Imam doesn't have special powers, but they believe in this stuff. Oh, you know, we don't curse the Sahaba, but they do curse the Sahaba. Like, I'm telling you, they practice a form like taqiyya, like just on an everyday thing, right? He said this is what he said, that, for example, if you were forced to eat pork and drink alcohol, do it, but reject it in your heart. If you're told to, you know, curse the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, do it, but reject it in your heart. Because if you didn't curse, they would punish you. It would also be, for example, if you can't do wudu, you know, not even do tayammum with a stone. Do tayammum with the wall. So you touch the wall and do wudu as a symbolic gesture. Or if you couldn't do that, plunge yourself into the sea with the intention of doing wudu. So this was the situation of the Muslims. If you were caught doing any Islamic practices or even have any inclination towards the Muslims, you'd be punished by the Inquisition. They got hold of this. So what did they do? All public bathhouses got destroyed, and you couldn't open a public bathhouse. Because you know the Muslims on a Friday, before Jummah, they would do a bath. The same thing, ghusl. And the same thing on Fridays, every single Morisco, and the Moriscos were the Muslims that became Christian. Morisco means little more, right? Or former more. You had to keep your door open on a Friday, Christian. So this was the situation. You couldn't practice Islam at all on the pain of death. So, and to the extent that, people would go in secret and do they would pray in the night. Instead of doing their 5 daily prayers, they would pray in the night to make up. This was the situation. Doors, as I said, doors would be open and people would rat on each other. They would snake it. They would tell it off. Oh, he's praying. He's doing this. He's doing that. Because they wanted to absolve themselves from the blame. They would absolve themselves from the might and the wrath of the Inquisition. So this is the situation, and I could go into more detail regarding the Morisco experience in Spain, but this was the situation. The Muslims couldn't live at all. And because at the same time, what was happening? There was the Barbary states in North Africa called or Muslim courses, and they would raid across the Mediterranean. And the Moriscos were blamed for this. They were blamed, oh, you're assisting the North Africans in doing all these raids across the Mediterranean. So there was more animosity towards the Moriscos. Furthermore, you have the Ottomans rising. Of course, they rose in the 1400s, but they were at the peak of their powers in the 1500s and 1600s. So all these factors culminated in the Moriscos being seen as a fifth column. And there was this problem because, again, they rebelled because in Valencia, and then this went to the Alpujarra Mountains, they rebelled because there was further bans on the Moriscos. You couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. There was further bans. There were all these, restrictions. And so they were thinking, okay, how do we solve this problem? So it took them a long time because they were in the 1570s and 1580s. They were doing all of these meetings and debates and councils. Oh, what should we do? Should we expel them? Should we force convert them? Should we send them to this place, that place? Should we disperse them? There was all these kind of things that they wanted to do. So finally in 1609, Philip III of Spain, he expelled all Moriscos. About 200,000 Moriscos expelled. And you might think, okay, cool, now the Muslims, they went to the Ottoman Empire, they went to Morocco, they went to all these places to practice the deen. But children were forced to remain. This is the situation. So in 1609 and 1614, it's completed. And this is the end of Muslim Spain and the Muslim experience in the Iberian Peninsula. So think about it. At one point in time, there was 5.5 million Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. In 1609 and 1614, there's 0. SubhanAllah. So, Jazakallah khair everyone for listening. And all good is from Allah, and any mistakes is my own. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.